Thank you. I appreciate the opportunity to appear before this board and share with you a little bit about the work of our office. I know that I was originally invited here so that you could pepper me with questions about things that are interesting to you. So I only take a couple of moments to cover our work, and then would be glad to talk with you about whatever it is that's on your mind. But obviously everyone in this room shares an interest in public records. So one of the things we wanted to do when I came into office in 2011, we promulgated some recommended best practices. Because what we found was the public, and you had found actually, I think the Society of Professional Journalists, if I recall, had done a spot audit a few years ago and found really widely varying conditions in local governments about how they respond to public records requests and how they deal with them and how they document it. So we recommended some basic things that are not statute, but we believe are really necessary to show that you are complying with the statutes that govern public records. Some pretty simple things like identifying a central point where folks can go to make a public records request. Documenting when a request comes in. How can you tell if it's a reasonable time under the law if you don't know when it came in or when you responded? And very importantly, I used to be a county prosecutor and advised local governments about this and had to defend, in a couple of instances, public records complaints where you don't respond, where you withhold a record. I think it's important to identify what records were not provided and what the rationale was, so that if you end up in court someday trying to explain it to the judge, you've got some records for that and not surprised. What we found, for the 2012 audit year, which we have been completing through 2013, we sampled 20 local governments, cities and counties. We found that 8 of them either had some sort of non-compliance with state law or failed to really properly document how they were responding. That's 40%. That's quite a bit, and concerned about it. Bottom line is, if you don't document it, if you don't measure it, then you can't really tell whether you're succeeding or not. The recommendations or the citations in those 8 of 20 counties ranged from some fairly serious things like not having a record retention schedule, which is required by law, to failures in documentation, failure to properly identify and log the requests and the fulfillment of it. Now, none of these rose to the level of a finding in an audit report. I want to specifically mention this. Sometimes we will, if there's something that's material to the internal controls or the financial viability of an individual government, that will actually be a finding in our audit report or a non-compliance citation. Almost all of these were, in fact, all but one, I think, were management letter comments that are really about best practices, about proper documentation, about running your government in accordance with those best practices. Because we had 40%, that's always, of course, when we're dealing with numbers, the question we always want to ask is 40% of what? And because the sample was relatively modest, only 20 governments, next year, announcing here today that we are going to double that sample to 40 local governments and take a little broader look and see if we see the same kinds of things. The purpose in doing this and not doing everybody, of course, is that there's a cost involved. When an auditor spends an hour to go pull some records, to do an interview, to look at whether a policy is posted as the law requires. That costs the local government money. And so we have these twin objectives between wanting to promote transparency in public records and compliance and openness, along with wanting to maintain the cost to local government and to not unduly burden local governments that already, frankly, are operating on a pretty skinny basis. So the idea of sampling, well accepted in auditing, and it's to provide a deterrent because you don't know whether you're going to be audited a year from now. The idea is that fact that you might be on the list that the auditor releases next year to the Association of Broadcasters would be a deterrent to say we really need to do this right. We need to follow the law. We need to be responsible.